Please welcome Detective Shiela Geathers.
Tonight, Detective Shiela Geathers brings us to the most horrifying turn in this investigation. The moment when a case of missing men and hidden bodies became something far darker than a killer stalking the streets. 3 men had already disappeared before sunrise. They were later found buried, contained, or forced into the ground with dirt packed into their mouths, soil found in their airways, and signs of restraint that suggested at least some of them had been held alive before death. Their bodies were marked with handwritten boards, like the killer was keeping records in a private graveyard, and by the time the third scene was processed in Red Hook, detectives recovered a blood-stained hammer that carried the first true physical mistake the murderer had made. What that hammer revealed was worse than anyone expected, because the print on it did not point to a drifter, a street predator, or a known violent felon. It pointed inside the system itself, to someone trusted with the names, locations, and movements of vulnerable people. Detective Geathers, tell the audience how that hammer exposed the man behind the graves.
The hammer was lying near a dead man who should have still been alive, and the blood on the handle was the first time the killer's body touched the investigation in a way he could not explain away. By then, I had already seen what he had done to the others. I had seen dirt packed into a victim's mouth so deeply it looked like the earth had been used as a gag. I had read the medical examiner's notes describing soil in the airway, which meant the possibility existed that at least one of those men had still been breathing when the ground was forced over him. I had stood near bodies that were not simply hidden, but arranged into a process, concealed under debris, marked by boards, and reduced by the killer into something like a record. The hammer was different because it showed his control had slipped. It had blood on it, pressure marks on the handle, and one usable area where the ridge detail from a fingerprint had survived. The forensic work on that hammer became the spine of the case. Crime scene technicians did not treat it like a dramatic object from a movie. They treated it like fragile evidence. Blood can distort fingerprints. Moisture can smear them. Pressure can flatten ridge patterns, and rough handles can break up what would otherwise be a clean impression. The technicians photographed it, preserved it, processed the handle carefully, and worked the partial latent print until enough ridge detail could be isolated. That mattered because fingerprints are built from small features that remain unique to a person. Ridge endings, bifurcations, ridge flow, loops, whorls, and the tiny relationship between one point and the next. A partial print is not enough just because it looks like a fingerprint. It has to survive comparison. It has to hold up under scrutiny. It has to lead somewhere without creating doubt. At first, the print did not return a criminal arrest hit, and that could have ended the lead if we were only searching the usual criminal databases. The man we were hunting had no prior arrests and no known violent record. He did not exist in the system the way our first suspects did. But 3 years before this case, an executive order from the governor required all state employees, including city employees in New York, to have their fingerprints entered into a collective employee database. Those prints were then available to be cross-referenced through AFIS, the Automated Fingerprint Identification System. AFIS is not a guess machine. It compares ridge detail carefully, point by point, across available records, then produces candidate matches that are verified through forensic examination. In this case, the employee database gave us access to prints that would never have appeared in a standard criminal history search, and AFIS scrutinized the hammer print against those records until the match was confirmed with complete accuracy. That was how we got Kellen Regame. Department of Homeless Services. No criminal record, no arrest history, no public warning signs. A man whose fingerprints existed in that collective database only because of his employment. That was what made the room go quiet when the name came back. We had spent days considering people outside the system, men who might have hunted vulnerable victims from the street, men with known violence, men with visible instability. But the hammer told us the killer had been standing behind an official role the entire time. He had access to names, he had access to placements, he had access to movement, he had access to the exact information a predator would need if he wanted to know when a man left the shelter system where he was placed and when he would be most exposed. Once we had Reg May's name, the investigation stopped moving like a search and started moving like an audit. We rebuilt him through records because records were his hunting ground. We pulled his personnel file, shift patterns, badge activity, access logs, workstation history, and every search he had made inside the placement system. On paper, he looked clean in the way dangerous people sometimes do when they understand how valuable invisibility is. No disciplinary file that explained the murders, no arrests, no obvious violence. He showed up for work. He remained consistent. He did what the system expected, just well enough that nobody had a reason to look at him closely. That was not innocence. That was camouflage. The deeper we went into the digital evidence, the more the murders began to line up with his access. He was not casually viewing files. He was repeatedly opening the records of the same men days before they disappeared. He looked at placement information, updated addresses, schedule details, housing transitions, and movement history. He studied the victims before they were taken. He knew when they had left the shelter system. He knew where they were being placed. He knew the new routines forming around them. That was the nexus that finally brought the case into focus. The bodies found in dirt, the handwritten boards, the controlled disappearances before sunrise, and the hammer print all led back to a man who had used official information to choose who would vanish next. That changed the psychological terror of the case because the victims were not merely unlucky men crossing paths with a predator. They had been selected from inside a system that was supposed to help them move forward. They had survived homelessness or instability long enough to receive housing placements, and that progress made them visible to Reg May. In his mind, their movement from shelter into housing was not success. It was disorder. He treated their progress like contamination. He believed he was correcting something by removing them. That kind of belief is more dangerous than anger because it does not burn out. It organizes itself. It builds procedures. It turns murder into a task.
Detective, once the hammer print led to APHIS, APHIS led to the employee database, and the employee database gave you Kellen Regmay. What did you do with the fact that the killer was not outside the system at all, but inside it, using official records to choose men before they disappeared?
We moved from identifying him to stopping him because the access logs showed he was not finished. That was the part that made the investigation immediate. If he had used records before each disappearance, then the next file he repeatedly opened could represent another living man already in danger. We placed digital surveillance around his activity. We monitored live access logs. We looked for repeated searches, unusual timing, and any file connected to recent placement movement. We did not have the luxury of waiting for another body. We had to let his own process point us to the next target before the grave was filled. The next pattern surfaced quickly. One file began appearing again and again in the access history. A man recently moved into housing, a new placement, a vulnerable routine forming, the same kind of victim profile as the others. Regmay was studying him, and that told us he had already begun the next stage. We combined the digital trail with physical surveillance, badge movement, vehicle checks, and known construction locations near the man's route. We were not just watching Regmay. We were watching what he needed: open ground, privacy, timing, and a victim he believed belonged back in the dark. The location came into focus in Brooklyn, near a construction site where the ground had already been opened and tools were staged in a way that made my stomach turn. It was not proof by itself, but by then I knew what open earth meant in this case. Open earth meant another man could end up with soil in his mouth, dirt in his lungs, and a board over him carrying his name. We moved before sunrise because that was when Reg May preferred the city quiet. That was when the streets had the fewest eyes. That was when vulnerable men became easiest to approach, easiest to isolate, and easiest to disappear. When we found him, he was not running. He was with another man, and the victim was still alive. That is the image that stays with me more than the hammer. A living man standing near the edge of a process he did not understand, unaware that the person beside him had already reduced him to a future burial. The ground was ready. The tools were nearby. Reg May was there because he believed he still had time to complete what he had planned. We announced ourselves, and his reaction told me everything I needed to know about the machinery inside his head. He did not show fear first. He showed recognition, like something had entered the system he had built and interrupted the sequence. He moved toward us instead, away from the victim. That is the part people need to understand. He did not prioritize escape. He prioritized completion. Even with police there, even with guns drawn, his first instinct was to challenge us so that he could complete the task with the man he had selected. He was still trying to finish it. An ESU officer tackled him before he could reach us. Kellen Reg May went down at the edge of the same kind of ground where he had put other men. He was taken into custody.
After everything you uncovered, after the hammer, the AFIS match, the employee database, the access logs, the prepared site, and the living victim who almost became another body in the dirt, what did this case ultimately teach law enforcement about the danger hiding inside trusted systems?
It taught us that the most dangerous predator is not always the one outside the locked door. Sometimes he is the one with approved access, an employee number, a clean record, and a reason to be exactly where nobody questions him. Kellen Reg May did not need to break into records. The system handed them to him. He did not need to stalk randomly through the city, hoping to find vulnerable men. He found them by watching movement inside official files. He knew who had been placed, where they had gone, and when their lives had become predictable enough to interrupt. The gruesome facts never changed, no matter how technical the investigation became. Men vanished before sunrise. Men were held alive. Men were killed and hidden. Dirt was forced into mouths. Soil appeared in airways. Bodies were placed underground and debris like records in a ledger. Handwritten boards marked names above concealment sites because Reg May wanted the removals documented. The hammer print gave us his body at the scene. The employee fingerprint database gave us his identity. AFIS confirmed the match with the precision needed to stand behind the investigation. The access logs proved the selection process. The prepared site proved he was still active. The living victim proved we had found him before the next burial. What stayed with me was not only that he killed, it was how ordinary the pathway to the victims had been. A desk, a login, a file, a placement record, a man's new address, a routine forming after years of instability. To most people, that information represented assistance. To Kellen Reg May, it represented opportunity. He turned a system meant to move people forward into a map for making them disappear. That is what made the case so disturbing. The horror was not disorganized. It was administrative. And in the end, the lesson was brutal. We found him because he finally dropped the hammer. Because a print survived blood and pressure. Because an employee fingerprint database existed. And because AFIS could connect a partial trace of his hand to a name no criminal database would have given us. Without that, another man would have been forced toward the open ground. Another mouth would have filled with dirt. Another board would have been written by hand, and another family would have been told that someone the city was supposed to protect had been buried by the very system that knew where to find him.
Thank you for watching this episode of The Case Files of Detective Shiela Geathers. We invite you to return and watch the rest of this exciting story when we return later this week with another episode. Have a great evening.